Friedrich Nietzsche is dangerous not because he advocates cruelty, domination, or nihilism, but because he removes the structures that normally protect people from confronting themselves. He does not attack morality to liberate human beings. He attacks it to expose what it costs. Nietzsche does not offer answers that can be safely adopted. He offers questions that destabilize the ground beneath the person asking them. To read him seriously is not to gain a worldview, but to lose one, often without receiving a replacement. This is why Nietzsche provokes such extreme reactions. He is turned into slogans, caricatures, and warnings because his actual challenge is too uncomfortable to leave intact. God is dead becomes atheism, the Übermensch becomes arrogance, will to power becomes brutality. Each of these reductions functions as a defense mechanism, a way of neutralizing what Nietzsche is actually doing. Nietzsche is not primarily attacking belief. He is attacking unexamined belief. He is not attacking morality because it is false. He is attacking morality because it presents itself as universal while serving hidden psychological needs. Nietzsche's danger lies in his insistence that values are not innocent. He argues that every value has a history, a psychology, and a function. Moral ideals are not handed down from reason or divinity. They are created by human beings responding to weakness, strength, fear, resentment, and suffering. To accept values without asking why they exist is, for Nietzsche, a form of intellectual cowardice. This is not liberation, it is exposure. Once values are exposed as human creations, responsibility returns with full force. There is no longer a moral system to hide behind. No authority guarantees meaning. No framework absolves the individual of complicity in the values they uphold. Nietzsche does not free the individual, he abandons them. This abandonment is what makes him so unsettling. Nietzsche removes transcendence without replacing it. He dismantles inherited meaning without offering a new foundation. He forces the reader to confront a terrifying possibility, that meaning is not discovered but made, and that making it is costly, risky, and lonely. This is why Nietzsche is not a nihilist in the shallow sense. For Nietzsche, nihilism is not the denial of meaning. It is the collapse of inherited meaning when it can no longer be believed honestly. Nihilism is not something he celebrates. It is something he diagnoses, and something he believes modern culture is already suffering from, often without recognizing it. Nietzsche is dangerous because he refuses to lie about this condition. He does not soften the consequences. He does not pretend that reason, science, or progress will save us. He insists that if values are to exist at all, they must be created consciously, and that creation will involve conflict, suffering, and self-overcoming. This is not a philosophy for comfort. Nietzsche writes for those willing to endure uncertainty without retreating into consolation. He does not promise happiness, he promises honesty, and honesty, in Nietzsche's hands, is severe. But this severity is not cruelty for its own sake. Nietzsche believes that false comforts weaken life. They produce resignation, resentment, and quiet hostility toward existence itself. His attack on morality, religion, and truth is not an attack on life, but an attempt to clear away the conditions that make life feel heavy, joyless, and dishonest. This is where Nietzsche becomes truly dangerous. If he is right, then much of what modern people call good, true, and meaningful rests not on strength, but on avoidance. Moral certainty may be a symptom of fear rather than virtue. Many values may survive not because they enhance life, but because they protect people from confronting it. Nietzsche does not accuse, he diagnoses, and diagnoses are hardest to accept when they touch something real. This is why Nietzsche's life cannot be separated from his thought. His ideas do not emerge from comfort, stability, or academic detachment. They emerge from illness, isolation, discipline, and relentless self-scrutiny. Nietzsche is not theorizing from safety. He is thinking from the edge. To understand Nietzsche, one must therefore resist taking sides too quickly. Nietzsche is not to be embraced or rejected immediately. He must be endured. His work is a test of intellectual courage, not because it is obscure, but because it refuses to reassure the reader that they are already justified in how they live. This video treats Nietzsche as what he actually is, a human being who lived under extraordinary psychological and physical strain, and who used that strain to dismantle the moral and metaphysical assumptions of his age, many of which still structure ours. To follow Nietzsche is not to arrive somewhere safe. It is to enter a space where inherited meanings fall away, and where responsibility for value returns to the individual without guarantee. That is why Nietzsche is dangerous, and that is why he still matters. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 into a world ordered by obedience, hierarchy, and moral seriousness. 19th century Germany was not yet a unified nation, but it was already a culture of discipline, intellectual, religious, and social. Authority mattered. Duty mattered. Order mattered. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on the individual long before that individual learned to question it. Nietzsche did not rebel against chaos. He rebelled against order taken for granted. He was born in the small village of Recurrence into a family shaped by Lutheran Protestantism and state service. This was a world in which meaning arrived pre-assembled. God, morality, vocation, and social role formed a coherent structure. One did not invent oneself. One inherited a place within an already defined moral landscape. The atmosphere of Nietzsche's early life was earnest rather than ecstatic. Christianity here was not primarily emotional or mystical. It was ethical, disciplinary, inwardly demanding. Life was framed by responsibility rather than expression, restraint rather than exploration. The self was something to be governed. This context matters profoundly. Nietzsche's later revolt against morality is often misread as youthful rebellion or romantic defiance. In reality, it emerges from intimate familiarity. Nietzsche knew moral seriousness from the inside. He was raised within a culture that prized obedience, humility, and self-control as unquestioned virtues. His critique is therefore not naive rejection, it is informed dissent. Germany in Nietzsche's time also placed immense value on education and intellectual rigor. Learning was not about creativity in the modern sense, it was about formation. Language, history, and classical study were instruments of discipline. The mind was to be trained, sharpened, and subordinated to standards of excellence. Nietzsche absorbed this ethos completely. From an early age, he exhibited an unusual seriousness. He was not playful, impulsive, or carefree. He was inward, reflective, and intense. He respected form, structure, and mastery long before he ever questioned authority. This is crucial for understanding his later thought. Nietzsche's later emphasis on strength does not arise from indulgence or chaos. For Nietzsche, strength is not impulse. It is the capacity to endure form, to bear tension, hierarchy, and discipline without resentment. That idea does not emerge from rebellion. It emerges from having lived inside discipline deeply enough to see both its necessity and its danger. Yet within this ordered world, a fault line already exists. The moral and religious structures Nietzsche inherited presented themselves as universal. Their values were not offered as interpretations, but as truths binding on all. Obedience was framed as virtue, doubt as weakness, difference as deviation. This universality would later strike Nietzsche as suspicious. A culture that claims its values are eternal does not have to justify them. A morality that presents itself as divine does not have to explain its origins. Authority becomes invisible, and therefore immune to critique. At this stage, Nietzsche does not yet articulate this suspicion, but he absorbs its pressure. He grows up within a moral universe that claims certainty while quietly demanding conformity. The seriousness of this world shapes him deeply, not only intellectually, but psychologically. Nietzsche learns early how much weight moral obligation can place on a human being. This weight does not crush him, it sharpens him. Nietzsche's later hostility toward herd morality, mass opinion, and moral leveling does not come from elitism in the shallow sense. It arises from a conviction that will take decades to fully form, that cultures which erase difference and demand sameness often do so not out of strength, but out of fear. The Germany Nietzsche is born into values sameness disguised as virtue. Everyone is meant to be morally equal, spiritually equal, bound by the same ideals. Nietzsche will later argue that this apparent equality conceals a deeper hostility toward excellence, creativity, and distinction. But for now, these insights remain latent. Nietzsche does not yet rebel against God, morality, or tradition. He inhabits them fully, he takes them seriously. This full inhabitation is essential. Nietzsche will not attack from the outside, he will attack from within. His later philosophy will not reject order in favor of chaos. It will ask a more disturbing question. What kind of human beings does this order produce? That question has not yet found its target, but it is already forming, quietly, under discipline, seriousness, and inherited certainty, and it will soon be given a human face. The most decisive rupture in Friedrich Nietzsche's early life arrives before he is old enough to understand it. When Nietzsche is just 4 years old, his father, a Lutheran pastor, dies after a sudden illness that leaves him mentally incapacitated before his death. This loss is not merely personal, it is structural. Nietzsche does not simply lose a parent, he loses an embodiment of authority. His father represents more than paternal care. He embodies God, moral order, and spiritual certainty. In a household shaped by Protestant seriousness, the father is the living symbol of divine authority translated into daily life. When this figure collapses, the world does not merely change, it fractures. For a child, authority is not abstract, it is lived. When Nietzsche's father deteriorates and dies, the connection between moral order and stability is quietly severed. God remains as concept. Doctrine remains intact. Ritual continues. But the living anchor, the presence that made authority feel grounded, disappears. This absence leaves a deep imprint. Nietzsche grows up surrounded by women, his mother, grandmother, and later his sister. The household remains pious, caring, and morally serious, but it is also saturated with grief, endurance, and quiet suffering. Faith persists, but it does so without confidence. God becomes something remembered rather than embodied. This distinction matters enormously. Nietzsche's later suspicion of morality as weakness does not arise from contempt for care or tenderness. It arises from intimate exposure to a form of goodness shaped by loss rather than strength. He sees how moral ideals can become compensations, ways of enduring powerlessness rather than expressions of vitality. The early death of his father introduces Nietzsche to mortality at an age when most children still experience the world as continuous and secure. Authority, once assumed permanent, proves fragile. Meaning, once unquestioned, reveals itself as contingent. This is Nietzsche's first encounter with nihilism, not as theory, but as lived disorientation. Importantly, Nietzsche does not respond to this rupture with rebellion. He responds with seriousness. He becomes inward, disciplined, and reflective. He does not reject God. He absorbs the moral weight of religion without the emotional security that once sustained it. This produces a tension that never resolves. On the one hand, Nietzsche inherits the moral vocabulary of Christianity: guilt, humility, obedience, self-restraint. On the other hand, he experiences the collapse of the authority that made these demands feel justified. God remains as command, but no longer as presence. Trust is broken. Nietzsche learns early what many encounter late, that the structures claiming to ground life can fail without warning. Authority can disappear while its demands remain. Meaning can collapse while obligation persists. This lesson does not make Nietzsche despair, it makes him suspicious. Suspicious of inherited authority, suspicious of moral certainty, suspicious of any worldview that demands obedience while refusing to acknowledge its fragility. Decades later, when Nietzsche declares that God is dead, he is not announcing atheism. He is naming a condition he has known since childhood, the disappearance of a grounding presence that once held meaning together. This disappearance is not triumph, it is trauma. Nietzsche's philosophy can be read, in part, as a prolonged attempt to answer a question first posed silently in early childhood. How does one live when the highest authority has vanished and yet its demands still echo? That question will drive him forward, into discipline, brilliance, art, illness, solitude, and eventually into one of the most uncompromising critiques of morality ever written. But before Nietzsche can become a critic of values, he must first master them. That mastery begins with education. Friedrich Nietzsche's childhood after his father's death is marked not by rebellion but by intensification. The household remains devout, orderly, and morally earnest. Religion is not relaxed to compensate for loss. It becomes more inward, more solemn, more demanding. Nietzsche grows up in an atmosphere where seriousness is not optional. It is the air one breathes. This seriousness shapes him permanently. Nietzsche is not a child of exuberance. He is quiet, reflective, and unusually mature. He does not resist discipline, he internalizes it. He learns early to govern himself, to restrain impulse, to take responsibility for his inner life. Moral obligation becomes something felt internally rather than imposed externally. This internalization is crucial. Nietzsche's later critique of conscience and guilt does not come from ignorance of moral life. It comes from having lived under its weight from the beginning. He knows how morality works not as theory, but as psychological pressure. In the absence of his father, authority does not disappear, it migrates inward. The voice that once came from outside becomes a voice inside the self. Obligation no longer requires enforcement, it becomes self-surveillance. Nietzsche learns to measure himself against standards that are never fully articulated, yet always present. This is the seed of what he will later call bad conscience. Though at this stage it is not yet named or analyzed, it is simply lived. Religion in Nietzsche's childhood is sincere, but it is not joyous. Faith is associated with endurance, patience, and moral rectitude rather than celebration or ecstasy. Suffering is not protested, it is born. This teaches Nietzsche something important long before he theorizes it, that moral ideals can make suffering meaningful without making it disappear. This lesson cuts both ways. On the one hand, it produces resilience. Nietzsche develops an extraordinary capacity for endurance. He learns how to live inwardly, how to carry weight without complaint. On the other hand, it produces a deep sensitivity to the psychological cost of moral seriousness, the way it can suppress instinct, vitality, and spontaneity. Nietzsche does not yet judge this cost. He simply absorbs it. He becomes introspective to a degree unusual for a child. He writes poetry, he composes music, he reflects on himself with a severity that borders on the adult. There is little evidence of rebellion, defiance, or playful transgression. Nietzsche's discipline is not enforced, it is chosen. This voluntary seriousness will later become one of his defining traits. It also contributes to his isolation. Nietzsche does not easily fit among his peers. He is respected but not intimate. His inwardness separates him. He lives largely inside his own head, cultivating a relationship with language, music, and thought rather than with social life. This isolation is not yet painful. It feels necessary. Nietzsche's early piety, therefore, cannot be dismissed as naive belief. It is a formative encounter with moral interiority, the experience of living under values that shape not just action, but self-evaluation. He learns how morality can inhabit a person, becoming inseparable from identity. This experience will later become an object of ruthless analysis. Nietzsche will come to see that morality's greatest power lies not in punishment or command, but in its ability to make individuals judge themselves, to become both accused and judge, debtor and creditor, sinner and law. But at this stage, none of this is explicit. What exists instead is a child shaped by gravity, by loss, by discipline, by seriousness, by inward reflection. Nietzsche's early life does not produce rebellion. It produces depth. That depth will soon find an outlet. It will be given structure, hierarchy, and form through one of the most demanding educational institutions in Germany. And there, Nietzsche's seriousness will meet mastery. When Friedrich Nietzsche enters Schulpforta, he enters one of the most demanding educational institutions in Germany, a place designed not to nurture personality, but to forge intellect through discipline. Schulpforta is not interested in creativity as self-expression. It is interested in mastery, endurance, and submission to form. Nietzsche thrives. Schulpforta is austere. Days are long, rules are strict, expectations relentless. Students are trained to obey schedules, internalize standards, and subordinate impulse to structure. For many, the environment is crushing. For Nietzsche, it is clarifying. This matters. Nietzsche does not experience discipline as oppression. He experiences it as sharpening. The seriousness already formed in childhood now finds an external structure capable of matching it. The inward weight he has been carrying meets a world that demands precision rather than sentiment. At Schulpforta, Nietzsche immerses himself in the classical languages. Greek and Latin are not treated as antiquarian interests. They are living disciplines. Students are expected to translate with exactness, to understand grammar, syntax, and nuance, and to engage ancient texts with respect for their form. There is no tolerance for vagueness or impressionism. Nietzsche excels. He develops an extraordinary sensitivity to language, to how meaning is shaped by structure, how nuance alters sense, how interpretation can distort or clarify. This sensitivity will later become decisive in his philosophical work. Long before Nietzsche analyses values, he learns how meanings are made. Greek tragedy becomes especially important. Nietzsche does not read Greek texts as moral lessons or philosophical arguments. He encounters them as expressions of a world that confronts suffering without moral justification. Tragedy does not promise redemption. It does not explain pain away. It gives suffering form and dignity. This encounter leaves a lasting impression. In Greek culture, Nietzsche finds an alternative to the moral seriousness of Christianity. Here, suffering is not interpreted as punishment, guilt, or failure. It is a condition of existence. Life is not justified morally. It is affirmed artistically. This contrast will haunt Nietzsche for decades. At Schulpforta, Nietzsche also learns hierarchy, not as domination but as differentiation. Excellence is recognized. Standards are not equalized. The institution assumes that not all capacities are the same, and it organizes itself accordingly. This assumption will later shape Nietzsche's hostility to moral egalitarianism. Nietzsche does not yet articulate this hostility, but he absorbs the idea that excellence requires distinction, and that the attempt to level differences often serves mediocrity rather than justice. Schulpforta also intensifies Nietzsche's isolation. He is admired for his intellect, but he remains inward and reserved. His seriousness sets him apart. He is not rebellious, but neither is he sociable. His relationship is primarily with texts, music, and thought, rather than with peers. This solitude deepens his independence. Nietzsche learns how to rely on himself intellectually. He becomes comfortable standing apart, evaluating standards rather than seeking approval. This self-sufficiency will later become both a strength and a danger. By the time Nietzsche leaves Schulpforta, he is already formed in ways that will never change. He has mastered discipline without resentment. He has internalized hierarchy without cruelty. He has encountered suffering without moralization. Most importantly, he has learned that form precedes freedom. This lesson will later separate Nietzsche from both romanticism and nihilism. He will never believe that liberation comes from the removal of constraint. He will insist again and again that strength is the capacity to endure and shape constraint creatively. Schulpforta does not make Nietzsche a philosopher. It makes him capable of becoming one. The next stage will give him something even more dangerous than discipline, authority. At university, Nietzsche's mastery will be recognized and rewarded. When Nietzsche leaves Schulpforta and enters university, his intellectual trajectory accelerates rapidly. What had been discipline and promise now becomes recognized authority. He does not drift through higher education, he dominates it. At the universities of Bonn and Leipzig, Nietzsche immerses himself in classical philology, the rigorous historical study of ancient texts. Philology is not interpretation in the loose sense. It is a discipline of suspicion. It trains the scholar to trace origins, expose distortions, and reconstruct meaning through painstaking attention to language, history, and context. This training is decisive. Long before Nietzsche turns his attention to morality, religion, or truth, he learns how meanings evolve, fragment, and harden into dogma. He becomes acutely aware that what appears timeless is often the result of slow historical layering. Texts, like values, are shaped by forces they later conceal. Nietzsche excels to an extraordinary degree. His professors quickly recognize his brilliance. He publishes scholarly work while still a student. His command of Greek literature, metrics, and textual criticism sets him apart. He is not merely competent, he is precocious. This precocity leads to an almost unheard-of outcome. At the age of 24, Nietzsche is appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, without having completed a doctoral dissertation. His reputation alone is sufficient. This appointment confirms something crucial. Nietzsche is not an outsider attacking tradition from resentment or failure. He is an insider who has mastered the highest standards of his discipline. This matters for everything that follows. Nietzsche's later attacks on scholarship, morality, and culture do not come from ignorance. They come from disillusionment. He knows the discipline from the inside. He understands its strengths and its limitations. Philology teaches Nietzsche how authority is constructed. Texts become authoritative not simply because they are true, but because they are preserved, interpreted, institutionalized, and defended. Meaning is stabilized through repetition and reverence. Over time, interpretation hardens into doctrine. This insight will later migrate from texts to values. Nietzsche begins to see that morality, like language, is something that evolves historically. It is shaped by use, power, and psychological need rather than pure reason. The seeds of genealogy are already present, not as philosophy, but as method. At the same time, Nietzsche's brilliance carries a cost. His seriousness isolates him further. He does not belong easily among peers. He is respected, but not intimate. His inward intensity deepens. His body begins to show signs of strain, headaches, visual disturbances, nervous exhaustion. The combination of intellectual pressure and physical fragility creates tension. Nietzsche is advancing faster than his body can sustain. Authority arrives before stability. Recognition arrives before grounding. The role of professor demands consistency, health, and social integration, qualities Nietzsche increasingly lacks. Still, at this stage, Nietzsche believes in culture. He believes that scholarship, art, and intellectual seriousness might redeem a civilization he already senses is drifting toward mediocrity and exhaustion. He does not yet see scholarship as sickness, he sees it as potential. This hope will soon attach itself to a figure who appears to embody everything Nietzsche longs for: artistic genius, cultural renewal, and meaning without moral consolation. That figure is Richard Wagner, and Nietzsche's encounter with him will change everything. When Nietzsche arrives in Basel as a professor at the age of 24, the achievement is extraordinary and immediately burdensome. He has not merely advanced quickly, he has arrived too early. Authority has been granted before life has had time to stabilize. Basel offers prestige without belonging. The city is orderly, respectable, intellectually serious. Nietzsche is admired for his brilliance, yet he feels no sense of home within the academic world he now inhabits. His colleagues recognize his talent, but they do not share his intensity. He lectures with precision and command, but privately he feels misaligned with the institution that has elevated him. This misalignment deepens quickly. The role of professor demands regularity, health, and sociability, qualities Nietzsche struggles to sustain. His body begins to fail him more persistently. Migraines intensify, vision problems worsen, periods of exhaustion become frequent. Teaching, reading, and writing exact a toll his nervous system cannot easily absorb. Illness isolates him. Nietzsche withdraws from academic life not out of arrogance but necessity. He lives increasingly alone. Conversation becomes effort. Social rituals feel draining. His work, instead of grounding him, becomes an additional pressure. Yet Nietzsche does not yet reject the academic world. He still believes in culture as redemption. He senses that Europe is drifting toward comfort, mediocrity, and spiritual exhaustion, and he hopes that serious art and scholarship might counter this drift. Basel, at first, appears to offer the institutional platform for such a project. This hope gives his early years there a sense of urgency. Nietzsche works relentlessly. He lectures, writes, and reflects with a severity that leaves little room for recovery. He pushes himself beyond what his body can reasonably endure. His intensity is not moderated by caution. He believes too much is at stake to slow down. This pressure produces a paradox. Externally, Nietzsche is successful, young, respected, prestigious. Internally, he feels increasingly unmoored. The academic role begins to feel like a mask, a structure that demands conformity while ignoring the deeper cultural sickness he believes it exists to address. Nietzsche begins to suspect that scholarship has become self-referential. It preserves knowledge, but it does not ask whether that knowledge matters. It refines interpretation, but it does not confront the question of meaning. It values correctness over depth, safety over diagnosis. This suspicion does not yet become hostility. It remains unease. At the same time, Nietzsche's emotional life finds a focal point. Through Basel, he is introduced to a figure who seems to embody everything he feels is missing from modern culture: artistic seriousness, mythic depth, and the capacity to give suffering meaning without moral consolation. This figure offers Nietzsche more than inspiration. He offers belonging. That figure is Richard Wagner. Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner will transform his understanding of art, culture, and himself, and it will ultimately teach him one of the most painful lessons of his life. But for now, Wagner appears as hope. Hope that art might redeem what morality and scholarship cannot. Hope that culture might still be saved. When Nietzsche encounters Richard Wagner, he believes he has found more than a composer. He believes he has found a redeemer of culture. Wagner appears to embody everything Nietzsche feels modern Europe has lost: seriousness, depth, myth, and the courage to confront suffering without hiding behind moral consolation. This belief is not abstract. Nietzsche is drawn to Wagner personally as well as artistically. Wagner offers warmth, admiration, and a sense of shared destiny. In Wagner's circle at Tribschen, Nietzsche feels momentarily less isolated. The intensity he carries inwardly seems recognized rather than merely tolerated. Psychologically, Wagner fills a void. He becomes a substitute authority, a paternal figure whose presence promises coherence where Nietzsche has long felt fracture. Wagner's confidence, ambition, and commanding personality offer a sense of direction Nietzsche has lacked since childhood. But Wagner matters to Nietzsche for deeper reasons than companionship. Nietzsche sees in Wagner's music the possibility of affirmation without denial. Wagner's operas draw on myth, tragedy, fate, and passion. They do not explain suffering away, they amplify it, give it form, and transfigure it aesthetically. For Nietzsche, this seems like a solution to the deepest problem of modern life. Modern culture, Nietzsche believes, is anesthetized. Religion promises redemption elsewhere. Morality promises justification through obedience. Rationalism promises explanation instead of meaning. All of these strategies soften suffering rather than confronting it. Wagner, by contrast, appears to confront suffering directly. Music dissolves rigid boundaries of the self. It bypasses moral reasoning and intellectual justification. It speaks to instinct, emotion, and shared experience. In Wagner's art, Nietzsche believes he sees a rebirth of the Dionysian spirit he admired in Greek tragedy. This belief crystallizes in Nietzsche's first major work. In The Birth of Tragedy, Wagner appears not merely as a composer, but as a cultural figure capable of restoring tragic seriousness to modern life. Nietzsche places Wagner alongside ancient Greek tragedy, treating him as a contemporary manifestation of a lost but necessary force. This is an extraordinary act of intellectual devotion. Nietzsche stakes his early reputation on Wagner. He ties his philosophical hopes to Wagner's artistic future. He believes that through Wagner, art might once again justify existence, not morally, but aesthetically. Yet even at the height of this devotion, tension exists. Nietzsche's affirmation of Wagner is conditional. He does not admire Wagner as entertainer or nationalist icon. He admires him as a tragic artist, one who confronts suffering honestly rather than sanctifying it. The moment Wagner's art begins to console rather than challenge, the bond will weaken. For now, however, Nietzsche is convinced. He believes that culture can still be redeemed through art, that suffering can be affirmed without denial, that modernity can recover depth without returning to religion. Wagner appears to offer all of this. This hope will not survive contact with reality, but before it collapses, it will shape Nietzsche's thought profoundly, giving rise to his first major philosophical statement and setting the stage for one of the most painful disillusionments of his life. The Birth of Tragedy is Nietzsche's first major work, and it announces him as a thinker willing to risk everything: scholarly reputation, academic standing, and intellectual safety, for a single claim: that life requires justification and that modern culture has lost the means to provide it. Nietzsche is not writing history for its own sake. Greek tragedy becomes a lens through which he diagnoses the sickness of modernity. At the center of the book is the opposition between two forces Nietzsche believes structure human experience: the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollo represents form, clarity, restraint, individuation, and measure. Dionysus represents excess, intoxication, suffering, the dissolution of boundaries, and ecstatic unity. Neither force is sufficient on its own. A culture dominated by Apollo becomes orderly, rational, and lifeless. A culture overwhelmed by Dionysus collapses into chaos and destruction. Greek tragedy, Nietzsche argues, achieved greatness because it held these forces in tension, allowing human beings to confront suffering without moralizing it, and to affirm life without denying its cruelty. This claim is radical. Nietzsche suggests that suffering is not a problem to be solved, punished, or redeemed. It is a condition of existence that must be transfigured. Tragedy does not console, it does not promise salvation, it gives suffering form, rhythm, and dignity. For Nietzsche, this is life affirmation, not optimism, not happiness, but the capacity to say yes to existence without lying about it. Nietzsche contrasts this tragic worldview with what he sees as the decline inaugurated by Socrates and Plato. Socratic rationalism replaces tragic acceptance with the belief that knowledge can cure existence. Life becomes something to be justified intellectually rather than endured artistically. From Nietzsche's perspective, modern culture inherits this mistake. Science, morality, and religion, All offer strategies for coping with suffering, by explaining it, condemning it, or compensating for it elsewhere. Tragedy, by contrast, refuses relief. It looks directly at suffering and affirms life anyway. This is why Nietzsche sees Wagner as crucial at this stage. Wagner's music appears to reawaken the Dionysian spirit, dissolving rigid individuality, confronting passion, and restoring mythic depth. The birth of tragedy, therefore, links ancient Greece to modern Germany through Wagner, presenting him as the cultural heir to tragic art. This move is bold and disastrous. Classical scholars react with hostility. Nietzsche is accused of speculation, mysticism, and intellectual irresponsibility. His philological credentials are questioned. The academic community does not merely criticize the book, it rejects it. This rejection wounds Nietzsche deeply. He realizes that the scholarly world values caution over diagnosis, correctness over truthfulness, safety over depth. The institution that elevated him is unwilling to confront the cultural sickness he believes it exists to address. The birth of tragedy thus marks a turning point. It ends Nietzsche's future as a conventional scholar. He has crossed a line. There is no return to neutral philology. The cost of intellectual honesty has become clear. Yet Nietzsche does not abandon the book's central insight. He will later criticize its style and romanticism, but he never retracts its core claim that life requires justification, and that this justification cannot be moral or rational alone. What changes is his hope. The birth of tragedy still believes in redemption through culture. Nietzsche will soon abandon that belief. Art will no longer save humanity. Wagner will no longer redeem suffering. Tragedy will no longer be a solution. What remains is the problem itself. The failure of the birth of tragedy teaches Nietzsche a painful lesson. Modern culture does not want to be diagnosed, it wants to be reassured, and Nietzsche is not willing to provide reassurance. From this moment onward, his path narrows. He withdraws from grand cultural visions and turns towards something colder, sharper, and more dangerous. The psychological investigation of values themselves. The next stage will bring disillusionment, not only with Wagner, but with the very idea that art can redeem existence on humanity's behalf. The reaction to the birth of tragedy is not merely critical, it is dismissive. Nietzsche is not engaged, debated, or corrected in good faith. He is sidelined. The academic world does not see his book as a flawed contribution. It sees it as a violation of professional norms. This response matters deeply. Nietzsche had taken a risk believing that scholarship could confront cultural truth. The reaction teaches him otherwise. He learns that institutions exist to preserve standards, not to endanger themselves by asking whether those standards still matter. Scholarship, he begins to suspect, has become self-protective. The rejection isolates him. Nietzsche's colleagues grow distant. His lectures lose students. His standing within the discipline weakens. The young professor who once seemed destined for academic greatness now finds himself marginalized, not because he lacks brilliance, but because he refuses to remain within safe boundaries. This isolation is intellectual as much as social. Nietzsche realizes that the academic world rewards precision without courage. It values technical mastery, but it avoids existential diagnosis. Questions of meaning are treated as illegitimate, too subjective, too speculative, too dangerous. Nietzsche does not simply resent this, he internalizes the lesson. If culture cannot diagnose itself from within its institutions, then critique must come from outside. If scholarship cannot ask why values exist, then philosophy must turn toward psychology, history, and suspicion. This shift is decisive. Nietzsche begins to lose faith in collective cultural renewal. The idea that art or scholarship might redeem society appears increasingly naive. Institutions, he now sees, are stabilizing forces. They exist to preserve what already exists, not to confront its decay. This insight deepens Nietzsche's solitude. he becomes increasingly aware that his questions do not belong anywhere. Religion cannot contain them. Morality resists them. Academia rejects them. Even art, he will soon realize, cannot bear their weight. The cost of intellectual honesty becomes clear. Nietzsche stands alone, not heroically, but painfully. His isolation is not chosen as a pose. It is the consequence of refusing to speak in a language designed to reassure. At the same time, Nietzsche's physical health continues to deteriorate. The stress of rejection compounds his illness. The migraines intensify, vision problems worsen. His body increasingly resists the life his mind demands. This convergence of intellectual isolation and physical fragility forces a reckoning. Nietzsche begins to recognize that the structures he has relied on, scholarship, culture, art, cannot sustain him. They promise meaning, but withdraw support when meaning is questioned. This recognition sets the stage for one of the most painful disillusionments of Nietzsche's life. The figure he still believes might escape institutional weakness, Richard Wagner, now comes under scrutiny. The hope that art might redeem culture will soon collapse. And when it does, Nietzsche will lose not only a cultural vision, but the last external authority he trusted. The break with Richard Wagner is not a single moment of confrontation or betrayal. It unfolds slowly, painfully, and irreversibly, as Nietzsche comes to recognize that the figure he once believed could redeem culture is moving in precisely the direction he can no longer follow. At first, Nietzsche resists this recognition. Wagner is not merely an artist to him. He is the last repository of hope, the possibility that meaning might still be restored without retreating into religion or moral consolation. To lose Wagner would be to lose the final external justification Nietzsche has allowed himself. But the signs accumulate. Wagner's later works increasingly embrace nationalism, German identity, and Christian symbolism. The art that once seemed to confront suffering now begins to sanctify it. Redemption, purity, and salvation return, not as theology, but as aesthetic ideals. The Dionysian gives way to moral seriousness clothed in myth. For Nietzsche, this shift is devastating. He sees that Wagner's art no longer affirms life in its cruelty and excess. It offers consolation, it reassures, it promises meaning by softening suffering rather than confronting it honestly. The turning point comes with Parsifal, where Christian morality is no longer implicit but explicit. Nietzsche feels betrayed, but more importantly, enlightened. He realizes that he has projected his own needs onto Wagner. Wagner did not change. Nietzsche's understanding deepened. What once appeared as tragic affirmation now reveals itself as a refined form of life denial. This recognition forces Nietzsche to confront a brutal truth. Even art can function as narcotic. Even intensity can conceal weakness. Even beauty can serve the same psychological needs as religion, offering escape rather than endurance. The break with Wagner therefore becomes more than personal. It marks the collapse of Nietzsche's belief in cultural redemption itself. If art, at its most powerful, ultimately returns to consolation, then no external force can save modern humanity from nihilism. This loss is profound. Nietzsche does not simply abandon Wagner. He loses a surrogate father, a cultural savior, and a sense of belonging. The rupture echoes the earlier loss of his father, authority disappearing once again, leaving obligation and longing behind. But this time Nietzsche does not seek replacement. He hardens. Nietzsche withdraws intellectually and emotionally. He begins to write against Wagner, dissecting his art with the same severity he will later apply to morality and religion. The admiration turns into diagnosis. The devotion becomes suspicion. This transformation coincides with worsening illness. Nietzsche's health deteriorates further. His capacity to teach declines. He begins to take extended leaves from Basel. The life he has built becomes unsustainable. The professor's role, the cultural project, the hope of redemption, all collapse together. The break with Wagner therefore marks a decisive turning point. Nietzsche abandons the idea that meaning can be restored collectively through art, myth, or culture. He turns instead toward the individual. If affirmation is possible at all, it must be achieved without consolation, without transcendence, and without shared guarantees. This shift reshapes his philosophy entirely. The grand, speculative tone of The Birth of Tragedy gives way to something colder and sharper. Nietzsche's style fragments. His targets become more precise. He no longer seeks to inspire, he seeks to unmask. From this moment on, Nietzsche's work will no longer offer visions of redemption. It will offer diagnosis, and that diagnosis will begin not with society, but with the human psyche itself. After the break with Wagner and the gradual collapse of his academic life, Nietzsche enters the most punishing phase of his existence. From this point on, he becomes a wanderer, not by choice, but by necessity. His life is organized around a single, desperate goal, surviving his own body long enough to think. Nietzsche's illness is not incidental. It is chronic, severe, and relentless. He suffers from crippling migraines, violent nausea, insomnia, and visual disturbances so severe that reading becomes impossible for days or weeks at a time. His nervous system is fragile, overstimulated, and unpredictable. Periods of intense clarity are followed by long stretches of darkness. This suffering shapes everything. Nietzsche does not philosophize about illness, he thinks through it. His body becomes a testing ground. Any thought that cannot survive pain, isolation, and weakness is discarded. What remains must be durable enough to be lived under extreme conditions. This is why Nietzsche develops such hostility toward consolation. Comfort is not available to him. Distraction is not possible. Community is largely absent. His philosophy is forged in conditions where illusion cannot be sustained for long. Any comforting lie collapses under pressure. Nietzsche wanders across Europe seeking climates that might ease his suffering. Italy, the south of France, Switzerland, the Alps. He lives in small rooms, boarding houses, and modest hotels. He owns little. He depends on a modest pension and occasional support from friends. His correspondence replaces conversation. Writing replaces companionship. This solitude is not romantic. It is exhausting and isolating. Nietzsche spends long periods alone with his thoughts, his pain, and his doubts. Yet this isolation sharpens his psychological insight. Cut off from social reinforcement, he becomes acutely aware of how belief depends on agreement, repetition, and collective validation. Ideas that feel obvious in company dissolve in solitude. Nietzsche begins to see society itself as a stabilizing mechanism, one that props up fragile values through consensus. Alone, these values begin to look suspicious. Moral certainties weaken when no one is present to echo them back. This experience transforms his method. Nietzsche abandons long, systematic treatises. His health will not allow them. Instead, he writes in aphorisms, concentrated bursts of thought forged under pain. Each aphorism must stand on its own. There is no room for excess, no patience for ornament. This compression sharpens his thinking. Nietzsche stops asking whether beliefs are true in an abstract sense. He asks what function they serve, what instincts they express, and what kinds of human beings they produce. Philosophy becomes diagnosis rather than doctrine. Illness intensifies this suspicion. Nietzsche becomes acutely aware of how suffering shapes values. He sees how weakness can generate moral systems that sanctify endurance, humility, and resignation. He also sees how strength can generate arrogance and cruelty. Neither side is innocent. What matters, Nietzsche begins to insist, is not suffering itself, but how it is interpreted. Suffering does not automatically ennoble. It can embitter. It can generate resentment. It can produce moral systems that condemn life rather than affirm it. Nietzsche becomes increasingly hostile to moralities that glorify suffering without asking what kind of life they produce. At the same time, Nietzsche refuses self-pity. This refusal is often misread as hardness or cruelty. In reality, it is discipline. Nietzsche knows that resentment corrodes the self. To surrender to it would be to let illness dictate values, precisely what he condemns. Instead, Nietzsche attempts something extreme, to affirm life without exception, including pain, fragility, and loss. This attempt does not bring peace, it brings severity. Nietzsche's solitude becomes a laboratory. In isolation, stripped of external supports, he confronts the mechanics of belief, morality, and meaning at their most basic level. He learns how thin the surface of civilization is, and how quickly it fractures when consolation is removed. It is in this wandering, suffering life that Nietzsche's philosophy undergoes its decisive transformation. He abandons hope in culture, art, and collective renewal. He turns instead toward the individual, toward instincts, drives, values, and the psychological mechanisms that produce morality itself. The next step is inevitable. Nietzsche's suspicion now turns inward, toward metaphysics, religion, and philosophy as such, not to refute them, but to strip them of transcendence. That turn finds its first clear expression in a book that announces its intention in its very title, Human, All Too Human. With Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche makes a decisive break, not only with Wagner, but with the entire metaphysical tradition that had shaped Western philosophy. This book does not announce itself with thunder. It works quietly, corrosively, dismantling assumptions one by one. The change in tone is unmistakable. Gone is the romantic language of tragedy and myth. Gone is the hope that art can redeem culture. In its place appears a colder voice, analytical, suspicious, and deliberately unsentimental. Nietzsche is no longer trying to justify existence. He is trying to understand why human beings feel the need to justify it at all. The title is intentional. Human, All Too Human signals Nietzsche's refusal of transcendence. What had once been attributed to God, reason, or metaphysical truth is now traced back to human origins: fear, desire, habit, weakness, power, and historical accident. Nietzsche insists that philosophy must stop pretending to speak from above life and instead examine life from within. This is not cynicism, it is honesty. Nietzsche begins to treat ideas the way a physician treats symptoms. A belief is not evaluated by whether it is true in some abstract sense, but by what it reveals about the kind of person or culture that needs it. Philosophy becomes psychological diagnosis. This methodological shift is profound. Nietzsche stops asking, "Is this belief correct?" He asks, "Why does this belief exist?" Truth is no longer sacred. It is examined like any other human creation. The aphoristic style of the book reflects this new posture. Nietzsche writes in fragments because he no longer believes in total explanations. Each aphorism isolates a single illusion and exposes it. There is no system offered to replace what is dismantled. The reader is left without shelter. This is deliberate. Nietzsche refuses to construct a new worldview because he believes that doing so would repeat the very mistake he is diagnosing, the desire for certainty at any cost. The fragments are meant to prevent the reader from retreating into a new metaphysics. Human, All Too Human also marks Nietzsche's break with Schopenhauer. He rejects the idea that life is fundamentally suffering to be negated. Nietzsche does not deny suffering. He denies that suffering justifies rejecting existence. To treat suffering as proof that life is a mistake is, for Nietzsche, another form of life denial, one that disguises itself as profundity, yet the book is not optimistic. It strips away consolations without replacing them. It leaves the reader exposed, disoriented, and often irritated. Nietzsche knows this. He expects resistance. He believes that honesty will feel cruel to those accustomed to moral comfort. What makes Human, All Too Human decisive is not any single claim, but the method it inaugurates. Nietzsche begins to treat morality, religion, metaphysics, and even philosophy itself as historical phenomena, products of human needs rather than revelations of truth. This shift prepares the ground for everything that follows. The thinker who emerges here is no longer searching for redemption. He is preparing for dissection. The next step is to define the kind of individual capable of enduring this loss of consolation. Someone who can live without metaphysical shelter, without moral guarantees, and without inherited meaning. Nietzsche gives this figure a name. He calls them free spirits. When Nietzsche speaks of free spirits, he is not celebrating rebellion, iconoclasm, or independence in the modern romantic sense. A free spirit is not someone who rejects authority impulsively or lives without constraint. On the contrary, Nietzsche's free spirit is one who has endured discipline deeply enough to move beyond the need for consolation. Freedom here is not permission. It is endurance. A free spirit is someone who can live without metaphysical shelter, without God, without absolute truth, without moral guarantees, and not collapse into despair or resentment. This is a rare capacity. Nietzsche never suggests that it is widespread or even desirable for everyone. Most people, he believes, require consolation. They need values that justify suffering, truths that promise stability, and moral frameworks that absolve responsibility. These needs are not weaknesses in the everyday sense. They are conditions of psychological survival. Nietzsche's critique is not contemptuous, it is diagnostic. The free spirit, by contrast, is someone who can withstand uncertainty without fleeing into belief. This does not make the free spirit happy, it makes them severe. Free spirits do not replace lost certainties with new ones. They tolerate ambiguity. They accept that meaning is not discovered but created, and that creation is fragile, reversible, and costly. They live without the reassurance that their values are universally valid. This capacity comes at a price. Free spirits are isolated. They do not belong easily within moral communities because moral communities require shared certainties. The free spirit's refusal to sanctify values makes them appear threatening, irresponsible, or cold. Nietzsche accepts this consequence. He does not propose the free spirit as an ideal for society. He proposes it as a counterweight, a necessary minority capable of questioning values before they harden into dogma. The free spirit is therefore not a destroyer. They are a tester. They examine values the way one tests materials for stress. They ask whether a belief can endure pressure without collapsing into resentment or denial. They are suspicious of ideals that promise meaning without cost. This suspicion extends even to truth itself. Free spirits do not worship truth. They ask why truth is valued and what kind of life that valuation produces. They are willing to sacrifice certainty in order to preserve vitality. This does not mean they embrace illusion blindly. It means they evaluate beliefs by their life-enhancing capacity, not by abstract correctness alone. Nietzsche knows how dangerous this stance is. Without discipline, it collapses into nihilism. Without strength, it becomes cynicism. Free spirits are not free because they reject obligation. They are free because they can carry obligation without myth. This is why Nietzsche insists that free spirits must be trained. They are not born. They are forged through suffering, solitude, and intellectual honesty. They emerge from the collapse of inherited meaning, not by escaping it, but by enduring it without retreat. The end of consolation is not liberation, it is exposure. Nietzsche believes that modern culture is already losing its consolations, religion fading, moral certainty hollowing, truth becoming instrumental. The danger is not this loss itself. The danger is that people will cling to the remains of these consolations, even after belief has collapsed. Free spirits represent an alternative response. Rather than denying the loss, they accept it. Rather than demanding new absolutes, they take responsibility for evaluation. Rather than moralizing suffering, they ask what kind of life suffering produces. This stance prepares Nietzsche for his most sustained and destructive critique. If values are not sacred and if free spirits can endure their collapse, then morality itself must be placed under the knife, not as error, but as creation. The next stage of Nietzsche's thought therefore turns explicitly toward morality, not to reform it, but to expose its origins, its psychology, and its consequences. That investigation begins with a simple but devastating claim: morality is not discovered, it is made. When Nietzsche declares that morality is a human construction, he is not making a casual or cynical claim. He is overturning one of the deepest assumptions of Western culture, that moral values are discovered, revealed by God, grounded in reason, or embedded in the structure of reality itself. Nietzsche denies this entirely. For him, morality is not a window onto truth. It is a response to life, shaped by human needs, fears, strengths, and limitations. Moral values arise not because they are correct, but because they are useful to particular kinds of human beings under particular conditions. This shift is seismic. Nietzsche does not begin by asking whether moral values are right or wrong. He asks how they came into existence at all, who created them, under what pressures, for what purpose, and crucially, what kind of human beings do they produce? Morality, Nietzsche insists, is not neutral. Every moral system encodes a way of relating to existence. Some moralities emerge from confidence, vitality, and the capacity to affirm life even in suffering. Others emerge from fear, fragility, and the need to restrain what one cannot confront or control. This distinction is diagnostic, not moralistic. Nietzsche is not praising cruelty or condemning compassion. He is examining the psychological origin of values. Moral ideals do not float above human life. They crystallize out of it. They express the instincts of those who create and sustain them. Over time, these values lose their visible origins. What begins as a survival strategy hardens into a commandment. What begins as interpretation presents itself as truth. What begins as response becomes law. Morality forgets that it was made, and demands obedience as if it were eternal. This forgetting is essential to morality's power. If values remembered their origins, they would invite evaluation. By presenting themselves as universal, they close off critique. Nietzsche sees this as one of morality's most effective and most dangerous features. He does not accuse individuals of deception. Most people inherit moral values long before they are capable of reflecting on them. Morality feels natural because it is absorbed unconsciously, reinforced by education, language, custom, and punishment. By the time reflection occurs, values are already embedded in identity. This is why Nietzsche's critique feels threatening. He is not attacking behavior, he is attacking innocence. He is saying that moral certainty rests on forgetting how values came into being, whose interests they serve, and what they suppress. Once morality is recognized as human-made, something terrifying happens. Responsibility returns. There is no longer a divine command to hide behind, no rational law to appeal to, no tradition that absolves. One must ask whether a value enhances or diminishes life, not in general, but for the kind of life it produces. This demand is heavy. It means that moral obedience is no longer virtue. Evaluation becomes obligation. Nietzsche understands why this is resisted. Morality offers safety, clarity, and protection from uncertainty. To expose it as contingent is to remove that shelter. Nietzsche does not deny the shelter's function. He insists only that shelter comes at a cost. Moral systems stabilize societies, but they also narrow the range of what human beings can become. They encourage conformity, suppress difference, and often mistake endurance for virtue. Over time, they produce human beings who are obedient, resentful, and hostile to excellence, while believing themselves moral. This is why Nietzsche's critique does not end with morality's construction. Once values are revealed as human-made, the question becomes sharper. What kind of morality has actually come to dominate? And what psychological forces gave rise to it? The answer will require Nietzsche's most controversial distinction, one that exposes morality not as unified, but as divided against itself. That distinction is between master morality and slave morality. When Nietzsche introduces the distinction between master morality and slave morality, he is not describing social classes in a literal or economic sense. He is describing two fundamentally different psychological orientations toward life, two ways human beings evaluate themselves, others, and existence itself. This distinction is easily misunderstood. Nietzsche is not praising masters and condemning slaves as people. He is analyzing the origins of values. Master and slave morality name two different ways of creating meaning, one that begins with affirmation and one that begins with negation. Master morality arises from strength. It begins with a spontaneous yes to oneself. The noble type experiences themselves as good, strong, capable, vital, and only later defines bad as what is weak, contemptible, or inferior. Evaluation flows outward from self-confidence. Life does not need justification, it is assumed. In this framework, good originally means noble, powerful, admirable, life-affirming. Bad does not mean evil, it means low, weak, common, lacking distinction. There is no moral outrage here, only differentiation. Master morality is not reflective. It does not ask whether it is justified. It does not seek universal approval. It expresses itself naturally without guilt because it does not doubt its right to exist. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from weakness. It begins not with affirmation, but with reaction. The slave type cannot express strength outwardly. They are constrained, socially, physically, or psychologically. Unable to act directly, hostility turns inward. Over time, it becomes ressentiment, a slow, corrosive resentment that seeks meaning in negation. Slave morality defines evil first. What threatens becomes evil. Strength, pride, ambition, and self-assertion are condemned, not because they are harmful in themselves, but because they inspire fear. Only after defining evil does slave morality define good, humility, patience, obedience, meekness, pity. Good becomes whatever the weak already are. This is not conscious deception, it is survival. Slave morality reinterprets weakness as virtue and condemns strength as vice. In doing so, it transforms a condition of limitation into a moral victory. Powerlessness becomes righteousness, suffering becomes moral superiority. This reversal is extraordinarily effective. Slave morality does not need force. It governs through conscience. It convinces individuals that their instincts are sinful, their desires dangerous, their strength suspect. Obedience becomes virtue. Self-denial becomes holiness. Nietzsche does not deny that slave morality stabilizes societies. He insists that it does so by revaluing life downward. It protects the vulnerable, but at the cost of pathologizing vitality, difference, and excellence. It creates order and resentment in equal measure. This is why Nietzsche believes slave morality eventually triumphs. It spreads because it appeals to the majority. It universalizes its values and presents them as binding on all. What began as a survival strategy becomes a moral law. Christianity, Nietzsche argues, is the most successful expression of slave morality. It elevates humility, meekness, and suffering. It condemns pride, power, and self-assertion. It promises redemption beyond life while teaching suspicion toward life as it is. This is not an accusation of hypocrisy. It is a psychological analysis. Slave morality is powerful precisely because it disguises its origins. It presents its values as divine, eternal, and universal, masking the resentment that gave rise to them. Nietzsche's point is not that master morality is morally superior. It is that moralities are expressions of life conditions. They are not neutral and they are not interchangeable. Each produces a different type of human being. Master morality produces affirmation without guilt. Slave morality produces obedience with resentment. Nietzsche does not tell us which morality we should choose. He forces us to see that we already inhabit one, and once that is seen, innocence is no longer possible. This insight leads Nietzsche to probe deeper into the psychological engine that drives slave morality, the slow internalization of hostility that turns weakness into virtue. That engine has a name: ressentiment. Ressentiment is the psychological engine that drives slave morality. It is not ordinary resentment, anger, or frustration. It is something slower, deeper, and far more corrosive. Ressentiment emerges when hostility cannot be discharged outwardly and is therefore forced to turn inward, where it ferments. Nietzsche treats ressentiment not as a moral failing, but as a condition. When human beings are unable to act, to retaliate, or to express strength openly, their instincts do not disappear. They are redirected. What cannot be lived becomes interpreted. What cannot be confronted becomes moralized. Ressentiment begins with impotence. The individual or group experiences themselves as constrained, physically, socially, politically, or psychologically. They cannot match the strength they encounter. They cannot dominate, compete, or overcome. Direct action is closed off. At this point, a choice presents itself. One can accept limitation honestly, or one can reinterpret reality so that limitation becomes virtue and strength becomes vice. Ressentiment chooses the second path. This choice is rarely conscious. Ressentiment works by altering evaluation rather than action. It does not say, "I cannot." It says, "I will not, because what I cannot do is evil." Strength is redescribed as cruelty. Pride becomes arrogance. Self-assertion becomes immorality. Power becomes injustice. Weakness, by contrast, is rebranded. Endurance becomes patience. Fear becomes humility. Submission becomes goodness. Suffering becomes moral superiority. The very traits forced upon the individual by limitation are elevated into ideals. This is moral reversal. Nietzsche insists that ressentiment is creative. It does not merely complain, it invents values. It constructs a worldview in which the powerless are righteous and the powerful are guilty. In doing so, it achieves a form of psychological victory without requiring actual power. This is why ressentiment is so dangerous. It allows hostility to persist indefinitely without resolution. The target is condemned but never confronted. The resentment is justified but never discharged. Over time, ressentiment becomes a stable orientation toward life, a lens through which everything is judged. This lens reshapes the self. The individual living under ressentiment comes to experience their own instincts as suspicious. Desire feels dangerous. Ambition feels shameful. Confidence feels immoral. Strength becomes something to apologize for rather than express. Nietzsche sees this as a tragedy of interiority. Ressentiment turns human beings against themselves. It teaches them to mistrust their own vitality. It produces individuals who are obedient, morally confident, and inwardly hostile, convinced of their righteousness while quietly resenting life. This is why ressentiment thrives under moral universalism. When a morality claims to bind everyone equally, it allows the values of the weak to govern the strong. What begins as protection becomes domination through guilt. The strong are not defeated physically, they are condemned morally. Nietzsche does not deny that this produces social order. He insists that it does so by poisoning the psychological atmosphere. Life is no longer affirmed. It is endured, judged, and justified. Creativity becomes suspect. Excellence becomes threatening. Difference becomes immoral. Over generations, ressentiment becomes invisible. Children inherit moral categories without knowing their origin. Values feel natural. Judgments feel self-evident. The resentment that created them is forgotten, but its effects remain. This is why Nietzsche insists that ressentiment must be exposed, not to eliminate morality entirely, but to prevent morality from disguising hostility as virtue. Without this exposure, moral systems continue to reproduce the same psychological structure while believing themselves humane. Ressentiment explains why moral revolutions often produce new forms of cruelty. When hostility is moralized rather than confronted, it does not disappear. It changes form. Punishment becomes justified. Exclusion becomes righteous. Hatred becomes duty. Nietzsche's analysis here is merciless. He shows that moral systems born from ressentiment do not overcome violence. They internalize and sanctify it. This insight prepares the ground for Nietzsche's next and most disturbing move. If ressentiment explains the origin of moral values, then morality must be examined not only psychologically, but historically, as a system that produces guilt, punishment, and self-cruelty over time. This leads Nietzsche directly to the heart of his genealogical analysis, to guilt, to punishment, and to the invention of what he calls bad conscience. In the second essay On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche turns to one of the most disturbing questions in his entire philosophy. Where does guilt come from? Not guilt as moral awareness, not guilt as conscience in the noble sense, but guilt as a felt, internalized experience of self-condemnation. His answer is uncompromising. Guilt, Nietzsche argues, does not originate in morality or divine command. It originates in debt. Before guilt was moral, it was economic. Before it was spiritual, it was bodily. The earliest moral relations were not between sinner and God, but between debtor and creditor. In early human communities, wrongdoing was not interpreted morally. It was interpreted materially. If harm was done, repayment was owed. If repayment could not be made in goods, it was made in suffering. Pain functioned as compensation. This is crucial. Punishment did not exist to correct the soul. It existed to balance accounts. To cause pain was not considered cruel. It was considered fair. Suffering created memory. It engraved obligation into the body. It taught human beings to remember promises. This is how responsibility was forged. Nietzsche insists that civilization begins with cruelty, not because human beings are evil, but because they are forgetful, instinctual, and impulsive. To make them predictable, society had to restrain them. This restraint was not gentle, it was violent. Pain trained memory. But as societies stabilized, something changed. The instincts that once discharged outwardly, aggression, cruelty, domination, could no longer be freely expressed. Order required restraint. Violence became regulated. Instincts that could not be expressed outwardly turned inward. This inward turn produces bad conscience. Bad conscience is not moral sensitivity. It is internalized cruelty. The aggressive instincts that once targeted others are redirected toward the self. The individual becomes divided against themselves, both judge and accused, jailer and prisoner. This is one of Nietzsche's most radical claims. Civilization does not eliminate cruelty. It refines it. It teaches human beings to punish themselves. The instincts that once produced action now produce guilt. The self becomes a site of punishment. Religion intensifies this process. Christianity, Nietzsche argues, takes bad conscience and gives it cosmic meaning. Debt becomes sin. Punishment becomes eternal. The individual is no longer guilty of a specific act, but of existence itself. Life becomes a moral problem. This transformation is catastrophic. Suffering is no longer something to be confronted or overcome. It becomes proof of moral failure. Guilt is no longer finite. It is infinite. The debt can never be repaid. The individual lives in a permanent state of moral deficiency. Nietzsche does not deny that this produces obedience. He insists that it does so at immense psychological cost. Bad conscience creates depth, interiority, and self-awareness, but it does so by turning human beings against themselves. The price of civilization is psychic pain. The individual becomes more complex, but also more tormented. This is why Nietzsche refuses to treat guilt as progress. It is not enlightenment, it is domestication. The cruelty that once structured external relations now structures the inner life. Self-denial becomes virtue, self-punishment becomes morality, weakness becomes goodness. Nietzsche is not nostalgic for primitive violence. He does not advocate returning to brutality. His target is the moralization of suffering, the transformation of pain into virtue and guilt into identity. Without recognizing this process, Nietzsche believes modern humanity mistakes sickness for morality and self-hatred for goodness. The genealogical method exposes this inheritance. It shows that our deepest moral feelings are not revelations of truth, but sediments of history, the accumulated result of punishment, debt, restraint, and internalized cruelty. This exposure does not tell us what to do, it removes innocence. Once guilt is seen as historically produced rather than divinely given, the question changes. The issue is no longer whether we are guilty, but whether the system that produces guilt enhances or diminishes life. This question leads Nietzsche to a broader synthesis. If morality, guilt, and bad conscience have origins, then they must be evaluated as systems, not judged individually, but examined as a whole. That examination reaches its most concentrated form in a single work, On the Genealogy of Morals. On the Genealogy of Morals is the point at which Nietzsche's project comes fully into focus. Everything that precedes it, illness, isolation, philology, suspicion, the critique of morality, converges here. This book is not exploratory. It is surgical. Nietzsche does not write the genealogy to argue against morality in the abstract. He writes it to show how morality came to be what it is, and why it now exercises such power over the modern soul. The subtitle is revealing: a polemic. This is not neutral scholarship, it is a confrontation. The structure of the book is deliberate. Each of its 3 essays targets a different layer of moral experience. Together, they form a single diagnosis. Morality is not a system of truth, but a system of training, one that shapes instincts, emotions, and self-interpretation over time. The first essay exposes the origin of moral values in power relations and ressentiment. It shows how the moral language of good and evil emerges not from reason, but from psychological conflict. Values arise as weapons in struggles between different forms of life. The second essay examines guilt, punishment, and bad conscience. It reveals how morality turns cruelty inward, transforming aggression into self-surveillance and debt into existential guilt. The modern individual becomes morally deep and chronically self-hostile. The third essay completes the picture by turning to ascetic ideals. Here, Nietzsche asks a final, devastating question. Why do human beings cling to values that deny life? Why do they embrace suffering, self-denial, and renunciation as ideals? The answer is not stupidity, it is necessity. The ascetic ideal, Nietzsche argues, gives suffering meaning. When pain cannot be eliminated, it must be interpreted. Asceticism provides interpretation. It tells the sufferer that their pain is purposeful, redemptive, and morally significant. This is its power. The ascetic ideal does not remove suffering, it justifies it. It transforms pain into virtue and weakness into moral superiority. In doing so, it prevents despair, but at the cost of hostility toward life itself. Nietzsche's verdict is merciless. The ascetic ideal is not chosen because it is true. It is chosen because it works. It keeps human beings going when no other meaning is available. It stabilizes cultures that would otherwise collapse under the weight of suffering. But this stability is poisonous. By interpreting suffering as virtue, ascetic morality turns life against itself. Instincts are suppressed. Vitality is condemned. Creativity becomes suspect. The will is trained not toward expansion, but toward negation. This is why Nietzsche calls the ascetic ideal a will to nothingness. It is not nihilism in the crude sense. It is structured, meaningful, morally organized nihilism, a way of living that preserves life by denying it. The genealogy, therefore, does not aim to abolish morality overnight. It aims to strip morality of its innocence. Nietzsche wants readers to see that morality has effects, psychological, cultural, and existential, and that these effects must be evaluated. Once morality is revealed as a human creation rather than a divine command, it becomes subject to critique. This is where Nietzsche's project becomes most dangerous. He does not replace morality with a new system. He refuses to legislate values. He demands that values be tested against life itself, against the kind of human beings they produce. The genealogy leaves the reader without refuge. There is no final authority to appeal to, no moral law to obey, no guarantee of innocence. One must decide whether a morality enhances strength, creativity, and affirmation, or whether it perpetuates resentment, guilt, and self-denial. Nietzsche knows how unsettling this is. He believes most people will resist it. They will moralize morality itself. They will condemn Nietzsche rather than confront the implications of his analysis. But Nietzsche does not retreat. For him, the exposure of morality's origins is not destruction for its own sake. It is preparation. If humanity is to move beyond nihilism, it must first recognize the values that keep nihilism alive. The genealogy therefore marks the end of Nietzsche's analytical phase and the beginning of something more demanding. If morality, truth, and meaning are not sacred, then what remains? That question pushes Nietzsche beyond critique and toward a new test, one that does not explain life, but weighs it. That test is truth itself. After dismantling morality, Nietzsche turns towards something even more unsettling, truth itself. He asks a question that philosophy had rarely dared to pose so directly. Why do we value truth? Not whether truth is important, but why it is treated as sacred. Nietzsche does not deny the usefulness of truth. He denies its innocence. For Nietzsche, the will to truth is not a neutral pursuit. It is an instinct, a drive that must be examined like any other. Truth is valued because it serves life in certain conditions, but it can also undermine life when elevated into an absolute. This insight forms the basis of perspectivism. Nietzsche argues that there is no view from nowhere. All knowing is situated. Every perspective reflects a particular position, set of instincts, and mode of life. What we call truth is always interpreted through human needs, language, and limitations. This does not mean that all interpretations are equal. It means that interpretation itself is unavoidable. Nietzsche rejects the idea that knowledge can escape perspective and reach pure objectivity. Even science, he argues, rests on values, on the decision to prioritize measurement, prediction, and control. These priorities are not dictated by reality itself, they are chosen. This critique is often misread as relativism. Nietzsche is not claiming that anything can mean anything. He is claiming that meaning is always mediated by interpretation, and that pretending otherwise disguises the values embedded in our ways of knowing. Truth, for Nietzsche, is a mobile army of metaphors that have forgotten they are metaphors. Concepts harden over time. They become taken for granted. They present themselves as natural rather than constructed. This forgetting is functional. Without it, communication would collapse. But when forgotten metaphors are treated as eternal truths, they begin to tyrannize thought. They prevent re-evaluation. They fossilize understanding. Nietzsche's suspicion, therefore, extends even to logic and reason. These are not mirrors of reality. They are tools forged to serve particular human needs: stability, predictability, survival. They work by simplifying the world, ignoring difference, and imposing structure. This simplification is useful, but it is not truth in a metaphysical sense. The danger arises when truth is worshipped. When truth becomes an unquestioned value, it demands sacrifice. Life is judged by whether it conforms to knowledge rather than whether knowledge serves life. Meaning, instinct, and creativity are subordinated to correctness. Nietzsche sees modern humanity trapped here. Science has replaced religion, but the structure remains the same. Truth replaces God. Objectivity replaces revelation. The demand for certainty persists, now without transcendence. This is why Nietzsche insists that truth must be evaluated, not obeyed. Some illusions are life-enhancing. Some truths are life-destroying. The question is not whether a belief corresponds to reality, but whether it enables a strong, creative, affirmative relation to existence. This claim does not license deception. It demands responsibility. To recognize that truth is perspectival is not to abandon rigor. It is to acknowledge that knowledge is always situated within life. The free spirit does not reject truth. They refuse to sanctify it. This stance prepares Nietzsche for his most poetic and demanding work. If truth is not absolute, if morality is human-made, if meaning is not given, then the individual faces a terrifying task: to live without guarantees and yet affirm existence fully. Nietzsche approaches this challenge not with argument, but with myth. The next stage of his thought abandons analysis and turns toward creation. It takes the form of a prophet, a dance, and a test so heavy that only the strongest can bear it. That work is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is Nietzsche's most enigmatic and demanding work. It is not a philosophical treatise, not an argument, and not a system. It is a test. Nietzsche abandons analysis and speaks in parable, poetry, and proclamation because he believes that what he is now attempting cannot be reasoned into existence. Zarathustra is not a teacher of doctrines. He is a figure of transformation. Nietzsche chooses the voice of a prophet not to imitate religion, but to invert it. Zarathustra descends from the mountains not to deliver commandments, but to announce the collapse of all commandments. He speaks not to found a church, but to expose the psychological need for one. This form is intentional. Nietzsche has reached the limits of critique. Having dismantled morality, truth, and metaphysics, he now confronts the question analysis cannot answer. What kind of human being can live after these demolitions? Zarathustra addresses this question existentially rather than theoretically. The book revolves around a single theme: overcoming. Human beings, Nietzsche insists, are not fixed creatures. They are transitional. The danger is not that they lack meaning, but that they cling to meanings that prevent transformation. Zarathustra's speeches repeatedly target complacency, comfort, herd values, moral self-satisfaction. This is why the tone is often harsh. Zarathustra mocks the crowd. He fails repeatedly. He retreats into solitude. He returns only to be misunderstood again. These failures are not narrative accidents. They dramatize Nietzsche's conviction that truth cannot be communicated directly to those who are not ready to bear it. Zarathustra does not persuade. He provokes. He exposes how deeply human beings resist self-overcoming. They prefer security to risk, reassurance to responsibility, belonging to transformation. The figure of Zarathustra therefore stands alone, not as a hero, but as an experiment. The work introduces Nietzsche's most famous ideas, but never as doctrines. The Übermensch, eternal recurrence, and will to power are not presented as theories to be adopted. They are challenges, ways of testing whether a person can affirm life without escape. This is why Zarathustra is written in a biblical style. Nietzsche is parodying revelation while exposing its psychological power. He shows how meaning becomes compelling not through argument, but through rhythm, repetition, and mythic resonance. At the same time, he denies the reader the comfort of obedience. There are no commandments, only demands. Zarathustra repeatedly withdraws because he recognizes that his audience wants instruction, not transformation. They want values they can adopt, not risks they must live. Nietzsche refuses to give them that satisfaction. This refusal is central. Thus Spoke Zarathustra does not tell the reader what to believe. It forces them to confront whether they are capable of living without inherited meaning. It does not console, it isolates. This isolation mirrors Nietzsche's own. The book is written during periods of intense solitude and suffering. It is the most personal of Nietzsche's works, not autobiographical but existential. Zarathustra embodies Nietzsche's own struggle to affirm life without illusions. But affirmation here does not mean optimism. It means saying yes to existence without conditions, without hoping for redemption elsewhere, without demanding justice from reality, without interpreting suffering as punishment or error. This is an extreme demand. Few can meet it. Nietzsche knows this. Zarathustra's repeated failures are acknowledgments of that fact. The book is not written for the many. It is written for the few who can endure its weight. And yet even Zarathustra is not the end point. The ideas introduced here are not yet clarified. They require further sharpening. Nietzsche must now separate misunderstanding from insight, distortion from intention. This leads him to isolate and clarify two concepts that have been more abused than any others associated with his name. The first is the Übermensch. Few of Nietzsche's ideas have been more distorted than the Übermensch. Reduced to slogans, misused by political ideologies, and confused with domination or superiority, the concept has often been severed from the context that gives it meaning. Nietzsche never presents the Übermensch as a ruler, conqueror, or biological type. The Übermensch is a task, not a person. It names the possibility of self-overcoming after the collapse of inherited values. It is not about mastery over others. It is about mastery over oneself, specifically over the psychological need for external justification. Human beings, Nietzsche insists, are transitional. They exist between what they have been and what they might become. The danger is not weakness itself, but stagnation. Clinging to values that no longer sustain life. The Übermensch represents the individual who can create values without appealing to transcendence. This does not mean inventing values arbitrarily. It means taking responsibility for evaluation, knowing that values are human-made and living with that knowledge without retreating into dogma or resentment. Self-overcoming is therefore central. Nietzsche does not admire those who dominate others. He admires those who overcome internal resistance, fear, resentment, inertia, and the craving for moral innocence. The Übermensch is defined by discipline, creativity, and the capacity to affirm life as it is, including suffering. This is why Nietzsche rejects political readings. The Übermensch cannot be collectivized, it cannot be imposed, it cannot be legislated. Any attempt to turn it into a social program misunderstands its purpose. It is an existential demand addressed to individuals, not a blueprint for society. Nietzsche's hostility toward nationalism, mass movements, and ideological conformity makes this clear. The Übermensch does not emerge from belonging. It emerges from solitude. It requires independence from herd values, not contempt for others, but freedom from the need for approval. This freedom is costly. The Übermensch does not enjoy moral certainty. They live without guarantees. They cannot appeal to universal laws or divine commands. They accept responsibility for the consequences of their values. This is not heroic in a cinematic sense. It is severe. Nietzsche contrasts the Übermensch with what he calls the last human, the figure who seeks comfort, security, and risk-free existence. The last human avoids suffering, avoids danger, and avoids responsibility. They are satisfied and spiritually exhausted. The Übermensch is the opposite. They embrace risk. They accept suffering as inseparable from creation. They do not seek equality of outcome or moral reassurance. They seek intensity, meaning, and affirmation without escape. This does not make them cruel. Cruelty, for Nietzsche, is often a symptom of resentment. The Übermensch does not need to harm others to affirm themselves. Their struggle is internal. Their enemy is stagnation. The Übermensch therefore represents Nietzsche's answer to nihilism. Not denial, not despair, but creation. After the collapse of God, morality, and truth as absolutes, the Übermensch embodies the possibility that life can still be affirmed, not because it is justified, but because it is chosen. This idea reaches its ultimate test in Nietzsche's most demanding thought experiment. If one truly affirms life, one must be willing to affirm it entirely, without exception, without regret, and without appeal to another world. That test is called eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence is not a cosmological theory in Nietzsche's work. It is not a claim about physics, time loops, or the structure of the universe. Nietzsche introduces it as a test, the most severe test of affirmation he can imagine. The thought experiment is simple and devastating. Imagine that every moment of your life, every joy, every failure, every pain, every regret, will return again and again, endlessly, in exactly the same sequence. Nothing can be changed, nothing can be erased. You will live this life again and again and again. Nietzsche asks only one question: would you curse this fate, or would you affirm it? This question bypasses morality, theology, and abstraction. It cuts directly to the individual's relationship with existence. Eternal recurrence does not ask whether life is meaningful in general. It asks whether your life is affirmable without condition. This is why Nietzsche calls it the greatest weight. If one requires redemption, compensation, or justification beyond life itself, eternal recurrence is unbearable. It exposes lingering hopes for escape, hopes that suffering will be redeemed elsewhere, that mistakes will be corrected, that injustice will be balanced. Eternal recurrence denies all of this. There is no final accounting, no cosmic correction, no moral resolution, only repetition. To affirm eternal recurrence is therefore to affirm life exactly as it is, including suffering, loss, error, and limitation. It is not optimism, it is not happiness, it is radical acceptance without resignation. This distinguishes Nietzsche sharply from both pessimism and consolation. The pessimist rejects life because it contains suffering. The moralist justifies suffering by appealing to higher meaning. Nietzsche rejects both responses. He demands an affirmation that requires neither denial nor justification. Eternal recurrence is not meant to be believed. It is meant to be endured. Nietzsche uses it to expose the depth of one's attachment to life. If one recoils from the thought, Nietzsche does not condemn that reaction. He treats it as information. It reveals how much one depends on hope for escape. Those who can affirm eternal recurrence are not morally superior. They are existentially honest. They do not need redemption. They do not demand that life be other than it is. They accept contingency, suffering, and finitude without resentment. This is why eternal recurrence is inseparable from self-overcoming. Only someone who has worked through resentment, guilt, and moral dependence can approach this affirmation. Eternal recurrence is not a starting point. It is an end point, the culmination of Nietzsche's critique of morality, truth, and consolation. But even here, Nietzsche does not stop. Having articulated the most demanding form of affirmation, he turns once more to clarify, refine, and sharpen his position. He becomes more aggressive, more polemical, and more explicit. The late works abandon parable and return to critique, now armed with the full force of his earlier insights. These works are where Nietzsche risks being misunderstood most, and where his philosophy reaches its final intensity. In Nietzsche's final productive years, his writing becomes sharper, faster, and more dangerous. The restraint of earlier analysis gives way to direct confrontation. He no longer diagnoses quietly. He attacks openly. The late works, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo, are written under immense physical strain, but with extraordinary clarity. Nietzsche senses time closing in. There is urgency in his tone, impatience with misunderstanding, and contempt for compromise. These books are not new departures. They are clarifications. Nietzsche now strips away the poetic ambiguity of Zarathustra and speaks directly. He names enemies. He exposes moral habits. He mocks idols. He refuses polite philosophy. Beyond good and evil deepens the critique of morality and truth. Nietzsche dismantles the idea that philosophers are seekers of objective truth. He portrays them instead as moral legislators who smuggle their instincts into metaphysics. Philosophy becomes confession disguised as argument. Twilight of the Idols is merciless. Nietzsche attacks Socrates, Christianity, morality, German culture, and modernity with aphoristic precision. The subtitle says everything: How to Philosophize with a Hammer. The hammer is not for smashing blindly. It is for tapping idols to hear whether they are hollow. They are. The Antichrist is Nietzsche at his most extreme. Here he confronts Christianity directly, not as belief, but as a moral system that sanctifies weakness, glorifies suffering, and teaches hostility toward life. This is not an academic critique, it is a moral counterattack against morality itself. Nietzsche knows how offensive this is. He intends it to be. Ecce Homo, written shortly before his collapse, is not autobiography in the conventional sense. It is self-interpretation. Nietzsche explains his books, his method, and his fate. The tone oscillates between lucidity and excess, confidence and instability. Nietzsche declares without irony that he is dynamite. This is not arrogance in the shallow sense. It is awareness of consequence. Nietzsche understands that his critique, if taken seriously, destabilizes the moral foundations of Western culture. He knows it will be resisted, distorted, and misunderstood, but he does not retreat. The escalation of the late works reflects Nietzsche's final position. There is no return to innocence. Morality cannot be reformed gently. Truth cannot be sanctified. Meaning cannot be restored by compromise. What remains is responsibility. Responsibility without guarantees, without transcendence, without appeal. This escalation, however, carries a cost. Nietzsche's intensity exceeds what his body and mind can sustain. The strain of isolation, illness, and relentless self-overcoming accumulates. The final phase of his life will not end in synthesis or resolution. It will end in silence. Few ideas associated with Nietzsche have been more aggressively misused than his concept of power. Reduced to domination, conquest, or brute force, Nietzsche's thought has often been conscripted into political ideologies he would have despised. This distortion is not accidental. Nietzsche's language is provocative, and he writes without moral cushioning. But his conception of power has little to do with control over others. It is primarily about self-expression, growth, and resistance to stagnation. When Nietzsche speaks of the will to power, he is not describing a desire to rule. He is describing a fundamental drive in life itself, the tendency to expand, to shape, to overcome resistance, and to impose form. This drive manifests differently depending on conditions. In strong individuals, it appears as creativity, discipline, and self-mastery. In weak individuals, it appears as manipulation, resentment, and moral condemnation. Power is not evil for Nietzsche. It is inevitable. Every value, every belief, every moral system expresses a form of power, a way of interpreting and organizing life. The question is not whether power exists, but how it operates and what kind of life it produces. This is where Nietzsche is often misread. He does not admire tyrants. He despises herd leaders, demagogues, and nationalist movements. He has contempt for mass politics, ideology, and collective identity. His hostility toward anti-Semitism, German nationalism, and political conformity is explicit. Nietzsche's ideal is not the conqueror, it is the creator. Power, in its highest form, is the capacity to give form to oneself, to organize instincts, endure tension, and create values without resentment. This kind of power requires restraint, not indulgence. It demands discipline rather than aggression. Nietzsche repeatedly mocks those who equate strength with cruelty. Cruelty, he argues, often signals weakness, an inability to bear internal conflict without discharging it outwardly. The will to dominate others frequently masks a lack of self-command. This is why Nietzsche insists that his philosophy cannot be politicized. Any attempt to turn it into an ideology misunderstands its core demand, that individuals take responsibility for themselves without hiding behind collective identity. Politics offers shortcuts, moral innocence through belonging. Nietzsche rejects these entirely. The misuse of Nietzsche by later movements reveals something important. Ideologies seek certainty, legitimacy, and justification. Nietzsche offers none. He destabilizes every attempt to ground authority outside the individual. Those who appropriate him do so by ignoring his warnings and extracting slogans from context. Nietzsche is aware this will happen. He writes knowing that his thought will be abused. He accepts this risk as unavoidable. A philosophy that refuses moral absolutes will always be vulnerable to misinterpretation by those who crave them. This is why Nietzsche insists that power must be understood ethically, not as domination, but as responsibility. To create values without transcendence is to accept the full consequences of those values. There is no external authority to blame, no moral law to appeal to, no ideology to hide behind. This responsibility is heavy. Few can carry it. The danger of Nietzsche is not that he licenses cruelty. It is that he removes excuses. This removal prepares the ground for the final chapters of his life, where his thought collides with history, illness, and misappropriation. Before turning to his collapse, Nietzsche must confront the question of how his philosophy will be received after him, and that reception will not be kind. In January 1889, Nietzsche's life as a thinker ends abruptly. In Turin, he collapses in the street after witnessing a horse being beaten. Accounts differ, details are uncertain, but the outcome is not. Nietzsche suffers a complete mental breakdown from which he will never recover. The silence that follows is absolute. At 44 years old, Nietzsche's productive life is over. The man who spent decades tearing away illusions, exposing moral cruelty, and demanding affirmation without consolation is suddenly incapable of coherent thought. Letters written shortly after the collapse oscillate between lucidity, delusion, grandiosity, and disintegration. Then the writing stops. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Nietzsche exists in a state of dependency. He is cared for first by his mother and after her death by his sister. The philosopher who insisted on responsibility without transcendence now lives without autonomy, speech, or authorship. This ending resists interpretation. Nietzsche's collapse has been medicalized, romanticized, and moralized. Some have tried to read it as punishment, others as tragic confirmation of his ideas, others as the inevitable cost of intensity. Nietzsche himself would have rejected all of these narratives. Illness for him was never moral. It was a condition. The collapse does not validate or invalidate his philosophy. It simply marks the limit of what a human body and nervous system can endure. Nietzsche thought under extraordinary strain, physical, psychological, and existential. That strain eventually exceeds what his organism can bear. What remains is unfinished. Nietzsche does not reach synthesis. He does not resolve the tensions he exposes. His philosophy ends not in harmony, but in interruption. There is no final system, no completed worldview, only fragments, diagnoses, and demands. This silence is fitting in an unsettling way. Nietzsche's philosophy refuses closure. It dismantles endings that pretend to justify existence. His own life ends without explanation, without redemption, without moral lesson. After the collapse, Nietzsche becomes an object rather than a voice. Others speak for him. Others interpret, edit, distort, and appropriate his work. His thought enters history without his consent. and history will not be gentle. Once Nietzsche's voice falls silent, his work becomes vulnerable. The philosopher who spent his life dismantling authority can no longer resist being turned into one. What follows is not dialogue, but appropriation. Nietzsche's ideas enter a world already hungry for justification. Europe is moving toward catastrophe. Nationalism intensifies. Ideologies harden. Moral certainty is weaponized. Into this volatile atmosphere enters a body of work that attacks morality, denies absolutes, and speaks openly of power, strength, and hierarchy. It is almost inevitable that Nietzsche will be misused. The most consequential distortion occurs through his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Deeply nationalistic and openly anti-Semitic, she takes control of Nietzsche's literary estate after his collapse. She edits, rearranges, and selectively presents his writings, shaping them to fit her ideological commitments. This is not interpretation, it is falsification. Nietzsche had explicitly opposed anti-Semitism, nationalism, and mass political movements. He despised herd ideology and racial thinking. Yet under Elizabeth's stewardship, his work is reframed to align with precisely the forces he rejected. Unpublished notes are rearranged into artificial systems. Nuance is stripped away. Provocation is turned into doctrine. Nietzsche is presented as a prophet of domination rather than a critic of moral innocence. This manipulation has devastating consequences. Later political movements, especially in the early 20th century, seize upon this distorted Nietzsche. His language of power is torn from its psychological context and reinterpreted biologically and politically. The Übermensch becomes racial fantasy. The will to power becomes justification for conquest. These readings do not emerge from Nietzsche's philosophy. They emerge from the fear of responsibility his philosophy demands. Ideologies crave certainty. Nietzsche offers none. To make him usable, his work must be simplified, moralized, and weaponized. The very ambiguity and severity that define his thought are treated as obstacles to be overcome. Nietzsche becomes a symbol rather than a thinker. This transformation reveals something crucial about reception. Philosophies that refuse consolation are rarely accepted on their own terms. They are either neutralized or converted into dogma. Nietzsche's fate illustrates precisely the process he diagnosed. Values are imposed where meaning is threatened. The abuse of Nietzsche, therefore, does not discredit his work. It confirms his insight. He predicted that his thought would be misunderstood, resisted, and co-opted. He knew that a philosophy which removes moral innocence would provoke backlash. The misuse of his ideas demonstrates how desperately cultures seek justification when confronted with uncertainty. In time, scholarship begins to recover Nietzsche from distortion. Critical editions, careful philology, and historical context gradually restore the complexity of his thought. The political caricature fades, the psychological depth re-emerges. Nietzsche returns not as ideologue, but as diagnostician, yet the damage lingers. Even today, Nietzsche is approached cautiously as dangerous, corrosive, suspect. This suspicion is not entirely misplaced. Nietzsche is dangerous, but not for the reasons often assumed. He is dangerous because he leaves no refuge, no authority to appeal to, no morality to hide behind, no truth that absolves. The final question is therefore not how Nietzsche was abused, but why his thought continues to provoke such misuse. The answer lies in what he demands. Nietzsche does not offer meaning. He demands that we take responsibility for it. This demand defines his true legacy. Nietzsche's true legacy does not lie in a doctrine, a system, or a set of answers. It lies in a demand, one that modern culture still struggles to meet. He forces a reckoning. Nietzsche exposes the fragility of the foundations on which Western meaning has been built. He shows that morality is not eternal, truth is not innocent, and values are not discovered but created. In doing so, he removes the moral alibis that have long allowed human beings to avoid responsibility for the kind of lives they live. This is why Nietzsche cannot be applied. There is no Nietzschean program. no political movement, no ethical code that carries his authority forward. Any attempt to turn his thought into doctrine misunderstands it. Nietzsche does not legislate values. He demands evaluation. At the center of his legacy is a simple but terrifying insight. If meaning is not given, then it must be made, and making it is risky. Nietzsche does not promise that value creation will succeed. He does not guarantee happiness, justice, or progress. He insists only that clinging to exhausted values produces resentment, guilt, and nihilism, even when those values are defended as moral achievements. The responsibility Nietzsche places on the individual is severe. Without transcendence, there is no final justification. Without universal morality, there is no innocence. Without absolute truth, there is no escape from interpretation. To live honestly under these conditions requires discipline, self-knowledge, and the capacity to endure uncertainty without retreat. This is why Nietzsche's work does not age easily. Each generation must confront it anew. His diagnoses cannot be memorized and repeated without losing their force. Nietzsche demands engagement, not reverence. He must be wrestled with, not followed. Nietzsche's legacy is therefore not consensus, but tension. He stands at the fault line between inherited meaning and radical responsibility. He does not resolve that tension. He insists that it cannot be resolved without cost. In this sense, Nietzsche is not a philosopher of answers. He is a philosopher of exposure. He exposes the psychological mechanisms behind belief. He exposes the cruelty hidden in moral innocence. He exposes the resentment disguised as virtue. He exposes the fear beneath the demand for certainty. And he exposes something else, more unsettling still. He exposes the possibility that human beings may not want truth if truth threatens the structures that make life bearable. He exposes the possibility that morality may survive not because it is good, but because it protects us from confronting ourselves. This is why Nietzsche still matters, not because his ideas are fashionable, but because the conditions he diagnosed have intensified. Traditional beliefs have weakened. Moral certainty has fractured. Meaning has become unstable. Yet the demand for justification has not disappeared. Nietzsche offers no shelter from this instability. He offers a challenge to live without excuses, to affirm life without appeal to transcendence, to create values without demanding innocence, to endure responsibility without resentment. This is not a message of hope in the conventional sense. It is a call to maturity. Nietzsche's legacy is therefore not triumph or despair. It is responsibility. And that responsibility remains unresolved, not because Nietzsche failed, but because he refused to resolve it on our behalf.